Welcome to this first virtual cargo claims and loss prevention webinar. My name is Christian Piaget, and I'm the regular organizer of the IATA Cargo Claims and Loss Prevention Conference, also known as the CCLP, that is usually taking place every year and has been going on for the last 15 years. It has become a trend over the past months, for reasons behind our will, obviously, to turn what used to be physical events and conferences into virtual webinars. And this event is no exception. A great part of the regular CCLP conference is the networking opportunity, obviously something that a virtual event cannot make up for. However, another essential side of the CCLP event is the common wish among partners in the air cargo supply chain to reduce the number of occasions for claims and the excellent occasion to share between experts the best practices, knowledge, experience on claims management, and resulting efforts to avoid unnecessary losses. In short, that event is usually appreciated because you come out of it with the impression that you've learned something. That is the intention for today as well. Usually, the event is 2.5 days long. Today, it will be only 90 minutes long. So I have decided to group the discussions during the next 90 minutes into two parts. Our first panel is gathering claims managers from different airlines, and our second panel, the legal panel, is gathering lawyers and legal experts from different parts of the world. The discussion will mostly focus on the impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic on the daily business of resolving and preventing claims. Each panel will last 45 minutes, and the first half of these 45 minutes will be dedicated to a discussion between the moderator and the panelists, while the second half of these 45 minutes will be dedicated to questions that are asked by the audience. We provided the opportunity to the registered participants to submit their questions in advance, and some have done so. But you can also ask questions anytime during the discussion by entering your question into the relevant box on the screen. I cannot guarantee that we will be able to answer all the questions. Actually, I can probably guarantee the opposite. We'll probably not be able to answer all the questions, but we will try within the limited time frame we have at disposal to cover as many grounds as we can. Now, there is one thing that is very important to keep in mind as well. It is that IATA and the panelists are subject to competition rules. So I will ask that everybody keep in mind these rules that you can see on the screen. Finally, the webinar will be recorded and made available to you. We will not use many slides, but the discussions will be recorded as well. So you will have an opportunity to hear what has been said today. Because we have limited time, I don't want to waste more of it, and we'll soon give the floor to the first panel. The Claims Manager panel is going to be moderated by Dan Soffin, an international aviation legal expert. And the panel will be split between Sanjeeva Abaisenge from Qatar Airways, Courtney Buckwalter from United Cargo, Janine Lascano from Amerijet, and David Suhasda from Polar Air Cargo. I look forward to hearing from them. So let's not wait any longer. And Dan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, panelists. You can, will the panelists turn their videos on and their sound, please? Thanks. As if claims handling and loss prevention weren't challenging enough, the past 8 months have produced an added dimension of challenge. Now, I know that each of you has experienced different challenges. Would you take a moment to highlight for us how COVID has affected cargo claims in your airline? Sanjeeva, could we start with you, please?
Yes, Dan. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who's joined on the call. So we've noticed a significant increase of low value or small claims, which are less than, let's say, $500 US, reported from customers when aggregated to a total of nearly 500,000. This could be a trend driven due to cash flow issues faced by companies around the world in the pandemic times. Ideally, small claims should be resolved swiftly, but when aggregated total of small claims comes to about 500,000, it compels airlines to investigate them, regardless of their low value, which impacts the overall claims turnaround time for customers. One positive observation is that formal claims are filed much sooner than pre-pandemic days, and it always helps airlines when a claim can be investigated as early as possible than having to do it after 18 months since the incident is occurred. We also see a different mix of cargo on board, more pharma and PPEs and perishables, and new players, and where sometimes with lack of experience on especially temperature sensitive commodities, selection of services by customers, also increased difficulties and an understanding of risks as compared to products they have purchased. Also suitability of packing and issues with defective packing, just to name a few.
Well, it's a good list there, Sanjeev. Courtney, could you address this?
Definitely. So similar to some of my other panelists, this particular year, we also had a transition with CEOs. So we moved from Oscar Muniz to Scott Kirby. And then just to kind of piggyback on what Sanjeev was saying, we definitely noticed an increase in claims, but specifically what we've noticed is in perishables and pharmaceuticals. And I think the cause of that really is just this new environment of ambiguity. You've got these canceled flights, rerouting last minute, and just these warehouses working in these high stress environments. And all of that potentially leads to increased cargo misplacement, misrouting, delays. So that's kind of the trends we've been seeing this year.
Janine, how are things at America?
We have seen a considerable change, and we have welcomed a new CEO, Tim Strauss, and CFO, Roy Hari Persad. And of course, as all of us are working in a new normal mode, relationships with our regular shippers have changed. The nature of the cargo being shipped has changed. The actual logistics of flying and cargo operations have changed. Challenges we have experienced include border closings, delays on clearances, station-facing shortages of skilled frontline staff, among others. We have increased claims for delay and misrouting. Especially with pharma, we are seeing increased problems with the accurate disclosure and representation of the commodity on the airway bill. The one very challenging item that stands out is obtaining key documentation required to evaluate and assess a claim. We certainly now can agree that digital preservation of documents should become a priority.
Fully agree, Janine, and I know that that's something that IATA is very much invested in, the digitalization of the whole chain. Dave, what's your view from where you sit with Polar and Atlas?
I think the biggest issue we've had, like everybody else, is the staffing. We've had disrupted flights, we've had crew restrictions, and a lot of our warehouse staff has ended up with the virus. We're seeing more claims. I think our big ticket item has been masks, medical equipment, and personal protective equipment, which has been needed for the COVID. The changes I see are twofold. First, we're having issues obtaining documents from our stations. This has been a real challenge, so now we're depending upon our customers to provide us with irregularity reports and other documents to assist our investigations, and it may be the key to for us to determine our liabilities for the carrier. We're also looking into we're seeing that customers are sending us their old files for claims. They're trying to submit old claims that border on the 2-year limitation. So it may make our claims handling a little faster in some respects. I'd like to point out, though, that there's no changes to our claims. There's no changes to the investigations, the assessment, the handling, or any other facet of the claims handling. In terms of our resolution and defenses, we adhere strictly to the Montreal 99 or the applicable convention. We consider the conditions of carriage for cargo, the conditions of contract on the airway bill, including provisions for U.S. liability, which is different than our international. Again, all claims are honored, provided we can find a written notification that the claimant the claim has been received within the 21-day Montreal requirements.
That's actually quite an excellent point, Dave, that with or without COVID, the principles of claims handling, investigation, liability assessments shouldn't be changing. Montreal 99 doesn't define the word, quote, event, end quote, and it applies to any type of event. Now, against that background, how are you all approaching claims and adapting your claims handling and resolution to accommodate the impact of the virus? Courtney, can we start with you?
I think the first approach is, if you haven't done so already, is identifying a new budget goal with your current COVID financial environment, because surely things have changed since you developed those goals, December of 2019. I think too, with this heavy influx of claims coming through, that you want to identify like a strategic approach when resolving. So you're going to be breaking down your claims by type of claim, dollar amounts, strategic accounts, right? So that you can actually tackle these claims. Another thing too as well is to establish a hierarchical approach, just to ensure that your key customers are handled appropriately and timely. They don't get lost in the this influx. Another thing that I would recommend to be more proactive and to be prepared as these claims are coming in is to run reports monthly, which identify possibly the past month's perishables that maybe exceeded the 72 hours. And that way you have an idea of your potential monetary liability, and you're able to present that too as well to your leadership, so there's no surprises. I think you're also able to kind of get an overview of the potential risks that you have. And at that point, I think you're just able to really provide a realistic assessment for your leadership. But moving on from the strategic approach and actually working the claims themselves, I have a rule for myself. It's if you touch the claim, you work it to close, which means you work as much as possible. You want to reduce the amount of times that you're in that claim. You want to reduce the amount of times that you open it and familiarize yourself with it again, because that's all time. So if you work it to close, the second that you touch it and you don't put things off, it might be time consuming in the beginning, but in the long run, it's going to be more thorough. It's going to reduce the work. It's going to also reduce the amount of errors, and the more thorough you are and the time that you take initially, you're also going to reduce that potential for disputes. So that's my recommendation, is work the claim to close. And then the last kind of little point of advice I would recommend is, this is a time where we're able to reboot and redo everything differently if needed, right? It's time to kind of assess what we've been doing and start with a new approach. And so with that, I think this is the perfect time to take a more customer-centric approach before denying a claim. And what I mean by that is, it was so easy for us to just get into the language and deny, but take a step back and actually ask the why. Why is this customer filing this claim? Why do they feel that they are permitted to ask for this claim amount? And by obtaining the why from your sales representative or from the customer directly, it actually might provide you a new perspective when you're resolving that particular claim. And then, of course, by reinforcing that relationship, in the long run, you're assisting with revenue generation and just managing the customer overall.
Thanks, Courtney. Janine, both you and Dave mentioned a moment ago increasing difficulties with obtaining documents by which to investigate and evaluate your claims. And you've already mentioned a concern with cargo misdeclarations on the airway bill. How are you all addressing this from a claims handling perspective? Janine? Your sound, Janine.
Sorry. What to do if documents are not accessible? The best possible solution to service the customer and resolve their claim within a reasonable time is, if the downline station cannot produce the documents, rely on the accuracy of the documents available with the cargo provided at the moment of receipt of cargo, as well as the information contained within our system. With regard to misdeclarations and undisclosed cargo on the airway bill, we take a firm position against these with our shippers and forwarders. At the moment, this is happening with increasing frequency with carriage of pharma. Forwarders want to ship pharma at a lower rate rather than paid for a more appropriate rate. Much has been invested in CEIV and pharma upgrade. We must make sure that pharma is properly disclosed. Of course, under the Montreal and our conditions of carriage, the shipper is responsible for the correctness, including accuracy, of the particulars of the airway bill. If any misdeclarations has contributed to the claim, we will raise that as a defense.
Very interesting. Sanjeeva, you mentioned significantly increasing issues with the suitability of cargo, packaging, particularly defective packaging. Has this become a greater issue in claims management and resolution?
So as simple it may sound, cargo must be packed so that it withstands the ordinary incidents of air transportation. That includes the complete chain of carriage from acceptance to palletization and depalletization to loading, unloading, warehousing at origin, transit, and destination, and up till delivery. So the packing serves a crucial purpose of safeguarding the goods in the course of carriage. And it is vital to separate and identify there are two different kinds of packing. One being the sales packages of goods, and the second is the outer packing available for safeguarding of goods. If the outer packing of cargo cannot withstand the ordinary incidents, for example, screening, palletizing, loading, unloading, stacking and storage at warehouses during the course of transportation, and provide adequate protection to inner contents of the shipment throughout the journey, we'll have to consider that type of packing as inadequate or insufficient packing. So the issue with inadequate packing is not only it can lead to a denial of a claim and release the airline from its liability, but it can also lead to shippers' liability involvement for damage caused to other cargo due to inadequate or insufficient packing of its own cargo.
Thanks very much, Sanjeeva. Dave, you earlier made a very important point that you're treating claims arising as a result of the virus as you would any other claims in less acute times. Would you expand a bit on that for our attendees?
Sure. COVID in and of itself really doesn't change the fundamental manner of how a claim is investigated, how a claim is evaluated, and the decisions that are made on whether to pay the full amount or negotiate a settlement, or maybe defend your position regarding to the packaging and so on. I think first, we must still insist on the normal documents. We need the airway bill, the manifest, the transfer manifest, written notice of complaint where it may be required, proofs of delivery, invoices, proofs of value, survey reports, photos, dump certificates, and the list could go on of documents that you can try to require or try to get in order to process your claim if for some reason your station documents are not available. If we can independently determine that the loss or damage or the delay may have occurred during the event of carriage by air, then we look at many things. We consider whether there's basis to defend the claim under the under Montreal Articles 18, 19, and also whether there may be some contributory negligence, so we can defend that under Article 20. We also rely on the applicable defenses on the airway bill, the conditions of contract, our general conditions of carriage for cargo, and any other document that may specifically give us or tell us about our liability, such as attack. These aspects of claim management remain consistent, and they guide us regardless of the COVID environment. We don't change our handling at all. Of course, nonconformities in our operation due to COVID, whether origin in the air or a destination, may have triggered a liability. So those principles apply still, whether there's weather issues or aircraft or grounded issues or internal space constraints. All this still goes into play along with the claim.
Thanks very much, Dave. That actually brings us to a very nice transition over to the equally important topic of loss prevention. Ironically, the virus may have had at least one beneficial effect on cargo operations, in that it's forced carriers to scrutinize all aspects of their operation to identify weaknesses and nonconformities as they arise and affect the operation. Now, you all are claims managers, you're experts, whether it's from your internal documents or your hands-on experience within the operation and with your service partners in particular. You all tend to have a unique overview of the entire operation from, what we would call sales to after-sales service, as they say, particularly impacting on the ability to prevent future losses. Can you offer some insights into the importance of loss prevention and practical steps that you all are taking to address loss prevention in your role? Dave, why don't you start that off?
Well, I think for us, we are trying to identify trends, even with the old claims. The trends being, what's the commodity and so on and so forth. So we try to get that and determine or see or look for the loss or damage in the commodity, especially for old claims. We try to work with the operations group and senior management. We'll bring up handling issues and so on to that group and we'll see if we can get quality improvement actions. Regrettably, during this virus, we've had short staffing issues, and that's affected the acceptance of the cargo. In that, technically, we don't have any time to inspect the cargo. Maybe the handling of the cargo at origin is done by short staff, and that may contribute to damages during the handling and buildup, which are not really reported to the management of our ground handlers. So this does make a real problem for us.
Janine, as we saw yesterday with the IATA presentation on pharma is a huge issue these days for all of you. You're a CEIV certified carrier. You're particularly concerned with loss prevention as it relates to pharma. Can you talk a bit about your concerns in that regard and what you're doing in terms of loss prevention from the perspective of a CEIV carrier? Your sound again, Janine.
Thank you. Thank you for keeping me on track. The carrier has invested a substantial amount of money to be certified CEIV, and now we are recertified. So controls, processes, training are in place currently. Together with the collaboration of the pharma industry, we should be prepared to provide the specific guidelines in packaging and handling. So when they present the cargo, it is ready for carriage. The positive aspect of the pandemic is that it gave us the opportunity to focus on our operation. There's fewer people at the dock, there's greater distancing, fewer distractions, less mixing of freight. However, pharma challenges include exceptions to the general cargo versus specialized cargo promised to specialize but sell general, multiple temperature ranges at origin versus destination, packaging. The packaging should be sufficient based on the commodity, temperature requirements, bookings, classifications, and trade lane profiles. Complex handling further complicated by insufficient packages or time constraints. Example is stretching the passive environment to fulfill an active container need. This misinterpretation of the product offerings and the airline capabilities. The use of undeclared temperature loggers, which can actually impact the shipment movement based on the dangerous goods limitations. Human error, communication improvements need to be recognized, and we must develop them further. Communication is especially important to the shipper and forwarder. Declarations and notifications which are essential so that we know and understand exactly what we are carrying and what restrictions there may be for that cargo and what problems it presents, whether it's for export, import, or transit. We need to have proactive communications with our customers. Best practices from outside, we need to review externally and collaborate with each other. If we can implement and coordinate these key aspects, we will have done much to contribute to the overall loss prevention effort.
Now, Dave, in contrast, neither Polar nor Atlas are CEIV certified at the moment, although it is in process. In the absence of CEIV structured ops, how do you approach loss prevention and minimize risk in carriage of cool chain product? And how do you educate your service partners and customers with loss prevention in mind?
Well, I know since we're not CEIV yet, we are looking toward shipments being tendered in an environmentally controlled container. I think that's the big thing right now, because we don't have refrigeration at all our locations. Again, the shipper is going to be responsible for the packaging, so he needs to package the cargo, at least for us, it's a 72-hour transit time. So he needs to package it with appropriate cooling mechanisms, maybe a blanket, dry ice, or whatever is maybe required for that packaging. I think the big thing is your customer needs to be aware of your service offerings, such as no refrigeration at transit stations, the possibility that your cargo may be staged on the ramp during transload operations, and possibly of any delays in your service offerings. I mean, that's the key right there. We're looking at taking an additional step of requiring that the customer sign an acknowledgement of our services. That means that they're aware of our refrigerating, our packaging, transit times. And so basically the signing of this document will make them fully aware of what we as a carrier can offer and or what we won't be able to offer. So they would agree to these particular terms.
Thanks, Dave. Courtney, you had some very insightful comment on the claims management perspective. What are your thoughts on loss prevention?
I think it's very similar. Going back, this is a time to reboot, right? It's a time for us to reinforce new behaviors because we've had to uproot and redo everything kind of in this COVID world. So with that, I think it's a good time to focus on the operational level of the warehouses and really holding the accountability. So reinforcing standardization, reinforcing training, and then again, the accountability piece kind of comes with subrogation, right? So if there is an error that was clear by the warehouse, going back to that particular vendor that's manning that warehouse, that business partner, if you will, and asking for reimbursement for the particular error or service failure. So I really think that accountability piece is how we kind of, again, reinforce that behavior. And then again, the strategic approach that I always like to put, looking at data, looking at trends. Dave kind of touched on this too as well. But if you're looking at the trends, looking at where these issues are happening and which warehouses and which airports, you can be a little bit more proactive in either shutting down that lane, if that's the particular issue, or you're just able to see a holistic view of what is going on versus kind of being more reactive.
Thanks very much. Sanjeeva, back to your earlier discussion of the challenges you face with new shippers and forwarders who may not understand mainstream cargo operation. What would your thoughts and message be as you try to educate these new supply chain participants and enhance your own loss prevention efforts at Qatar?
So I would say select the most appropriate service offered by the airline that best suits their product, and evaluate all new risks that have come up with, especially with the pandemic situation. For example, sudden closure of borders, cancellation of flights, and unforeseen delays in customs. Along with lack of manpower in airports and warehouses with the pandemic situation, some staff being isolated and placed in quarantine and situations like that. Shippers can always plan for possible contingencies in advance by coordinating with airlines for prevention or even mitigation of losses in such situations. It's essential to be aware of their airline partners' network capability and availability of right infrastructure prior to shipping any product. Be aware of practical limitations that airlines do face in terms of especially cold chain management, and always use adequate packing to protect cargo throughout journey.
Thanks very much, Sanjeeva. Now, we're preparing in a few minutes to take questions, but before we move to that segment, could I ask each of you just to give your final thoughts, your words of wisdom, for lack of a better word, on claims handling and loss prevention generally these days? Courtney, why don't you start?
I can definitely do that. So I guess my little piece it would be to ensure all documentation is provided initially when filing the claim. And once that's provided, or if that is provided, that's going to be the most streamlined experience for you as a customer. So the necessary items that we're looking for is a copy of the carrier's delivery slip, the carrier's master airway bill, that's essential, your commercial invoice and packing list, but not only that, make sure that it's itemized. Of course, your proof of mitigation, was there a repair estimate, or is there any potential salvage value? Of course, survey report if applicable, high dollar amounts, that's what we like to see. And then proof of destruction or proof of disposal of that particular item that was damaged. So just reinforcing that all documentation is provided first off, and again,
Courtney, thanks very much. Janine, what are your thoughts?
No, first, I want to thank Cargo Hub for their platform, because without them, I would have never gone through COVID times. But I would like for everyone to ascertain exposures, eliminate them before a loss occurs. Focus on essential critical elements such as documentation, strong decision-making abilities, and the confidence to excel in a stressful and fast-paced work environment.
And Dave, how about you?
Mine's going to be familiar with your TAC tariff if it's filed. Be familiar with your terms and conditions on your airway bill, your general conditions of carriage for cargo, as well as the Montreal 1999 Convention for Defenses of Claims, such as Articles 18, 19, and 20. Additionally, in Montreal 1999, Article 10 on the shipper's responsibility for particulars on the airway bill, and Montreal 1999 Article 16 regarding shippers' requirements to provide proper documentation for customs and public authorities is very important in these COVID times.
A good way to end that, Dave. All of you, thanks very much for a really excellent targeted discussion on how COVID has impacted the claims management function, how claims are being managed and handled with eyes always firmly focused on loss prevention. Let's move over to some questions now, and I'm just scanning to see what questions we have. We've got some quite interesting ones. One question which has been raised by a number of people involves temperature instructions that may be entered by a shipper or a forwarder onto an airway bill. It's quite an interesting question, but with a definite legal component there. And we've spoken with our legal panel. They're going to answer that question in much more detail when they have their panel. Now, another question that we have is, we've talked about increased claimant activity. We haven't yet spoken about indemnity and SLA service level agreement recoveries. How are you all managing recoveries from ground handlers and service partners? Courtney, why don't you take that from the top?
Make sure that I am unmuted. Let's see. I think as an airline, we just want to make sure that in this specific environment, that we want to bring cash on hand. So whatever we can do to bring more cash on hand, and that includes recovering those small dollar amounts. And I know that, again, Sanjeeva was talking on this or touched on this a little bit, but it is really worth dedicating time in your week as a claims adjuster to really focus on those small dollar amounts and for those recoveries when it comes to subrogation. Because these small dollar amounts, they can actually add up pretty quickly. And they're usually quick wins. And I think they can even help with establishing the relationship too as well with your business.
I think you've cut out just a little bit.
I'm sorry?
You cut out a little bit, at least from my end. Did you want to just repeat the last couple of sentences?
So it's worth dedicating time basically in your week as a claims adjuster, because it is time consuming to focus on subrogation efforts, right? For those quick wins, those small little dollar amounts, because they add up very quickly. And again, they reinforce those relationships with your business partners, your service partners at the warehouses. But what I was also touching on was that just in this new environment, we're actually seeing overall across the board more willingness from our service partners to resolve the issues and encourage loss prevention. And then they're also much quicker with reimbursing in these claims that we've paid out on. And overall, I'm just seeing that this is a time and opportunity to maintain our relationships, build those relationships with our service partners and the airline, while also recovering those the cash on hand.
Thanks. Sanjeeva, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, just as Courtney mentioned, we experience similar situations. We definitely devote time for recovery when we can clearly identify there are non-conformities on services provided by GHAs, and we try to recover these losses from the service partners. But it's equally important we use these opportunities to educate our GHA partners and other service providers, especially to establish loss prevention and corrective action plans for all stakeholders involved in the supply chain.
Sanjeeva, you talk about the corrective action plan. Do you all sit down and review on a routine basis the corrective action plans with your service partners?
Yeah, so depending on the service failure, we carry out corrective action plans. Sometimes we call them CAPAs, and it involves a broad elaboration on the process in place and see where things have gone wrong, how we can do things better, and so on and so forth, to make sure either to prevent those situations in future, or to at least to mitigate losses and therefore avoid claims.
Gotcha. Thanks very much. We are noticing also a number of questions on, in general terms, written notices of complaint, which seems to be a topic that we've had every year for the past 15 or so years with the Cargo Claims and Loss Prevention Conference. We spoke earlier about the need for and the difficulties of obtaining proper documentation for claims assessment. Now, the 14 or 21 day written notice of complaint under Article 31 of Montreal 99 is certainly considered without fail to be a key document in liability determination. What are you all looking for in terms of form, format, and specificity of the written notice? Sanjeeva, I know that you also raised this independently. Why don't you start with that?
So the notice to carrier is a very important part when it comes to assessment of claims, because it's done in accordance with the convention regulations. And Article 31 requires a written notice of complaint to the carrier. It needs to be detailed and specific, especially with details of the consignment, such as airway bill and flight details. It must be clear. It must clearly state whether the claim is for damage or delay. It must be given by the person entitled to delivery, or the person verifiable by the agent. I'm sorry. Sometimes there could be misunderstandings, like a damage report issued by an agent or a GHA could be considered a notice of claim, which is not. They do not come from the person entitled to delivery. Similarly, in the event of damage or delay, although we may contact shippers or consignees via email, requesting for cargo status, and they may respond with their instructions for disposal by email. But unfortunately, that kind of communication are specifically relating to instructions given to carrier for disposal of cargo, not necessarily a notice to airline, does not qualify as a notice given to airline in terms of claim. So those instructions for disposition do not necessarily meet the requirement for Article 31 written notice to carrier.
Thanks. Does anyone else have a comment? Janine, have you any notions on this?
Yes, Article 31, written notice of complaint, is a key component to the claim. It's especially important with subrogated claims because claimants may turn directly to their cargo insurers for compensation without notifying us of their claim. Since subrogated insurance have no better claim or right than their cargo customer, if there is no Article 31 written notice of complaint from the person entitled to delivery, subrogators insurers have no entitlement to reimbursement, and we would deny their claim.
100% agreed there, Janine. you mentioned before digitalization. With all the cargo technology, operational infrastructure, and service partner changes we're seeing today, do you think there should be any changes, or should we be looking at revisions to the main instruments that we use today, like the standard ground handling agreement and the service level agreements?
Yes, we absolutely should be improving and streamlining, aligning the contractual instruments used for handling, especially in light of new technology, operational structures, and supply chain relationships. There is a need for a global effort in this regard. Carriers are mostly handled by third parties. The SGH have been modified considerably over the years, and new versions may not be the one that the carrier is using under. Now, the ground handling agreements have been revised 2004, 8, 13, and 2018, etc., and not necessarily align with the SLA or even the SOPs that the carriers use. So carriers may be operating under numerous versions of ground handling agreements and SLAs in different stations and with different service partners. Streamlining and aligning these agreements will certainly assist in claims management and recoveries across the entire network. This new mode of service level agreements have become a new guideline, and forwarders are looking for signed SLAs, which are contracts, which are also used now for CAPA reports. So prior to a settlement, it is essential that you know if those exist for that particular claimant, and what version is the proper version on the ground handling, the SLAs, the CAPAs, the SOPs. So we have a duty there to make sure that we know.
Courtney, I know you've also got quite a strong interest in technology and digitalization. Do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I just think technological advances are really key in modernizing and really bringing this industry into 2020. And so I think this is, when it comes to claims management specifically, as an industry, we're still very reliant and heavy on emails, and in some cases physical paper. And so I think like if we look at another similar industry such as auto claims, which I did in my past life, each major insurance company has their own internal management system and own specific intake form. So I think at this particular time, it would be maybe something to discuss or something that we can look into, where all of our different, as airlines, all our external systems maybe can speak to each other in some form of another. So that way it's not, again, so heavily reliant on email, because that just leads to potential errors or human error and mishandling or overseeing. So again, I just think this is a time, since everything's being rebooted, new environment, that we can actually look at technology and see if we can enhance that. And then let's see. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. We're right up. We're right up against our 45 minutes. So I think, Christian, with that in mind, first of all, I want to thank the whole panel for a very, very nice presentation. Christian, can I send it over to you now for our legal panel?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Dan, and thank you to all the panelists for this
Thank
very
you
good discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yes, and so some of the topics actually that have been raised in this panel will be discussed in the next panel as well. That second panel is focusing more on the perspective from lawyers, and it will be moderated by Bart Panino, based in New York, and is gathering legal experts from different jurisdictions, with Rainer Amann from Germany, Ricardo Bernardi from Brazil, Giuseppe Gatto from Germany, like Rainer, but with the insurance perspective, and Frank Monbach from the United States. I think with views from Europe, the US, and South America, I'm sure we'll have a very interesting perspectives on the way various jurisdictions are managing the cargo claims under the current circumstances. So Bart, I'll let you the floor. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. And thanks to Dan and his panel as well. It's always interesting. And thanks for IATA for setting up, I guess, the home edition of the CCLP that we've got going on. Well, I'm happy to say we have as Christian said, we have a world-class panel of experts here. And for those of you in the audience, many of you may work with these folks, and really some of the best minds on cargo claims handling. So I don't want to waste too much time because we'd like to cover a lot and answer some of your questions. So, let's start with the topic of the day, and that is, of course, the pandemic. Obviously, these are unprecedented times, as Dan and Christian said, that's caused flight cancellations, flight delays, transportation has been stressed. And as lawyers dealing with cargo claims, there are a lot of unique issues that are particular to this type of situation. Looking at the big picture and the big issues, Frank, you want to lead us off and kind of give us some framework for some of the issues we're looking at as claims handling lawyers?
Yeah, when we first started talking with Christian about this, one of the first things was obviously COVID-19 and its effect, and legally, what is the impact of COVID-19 on legal claims? It was interesting to listen to the panel before that Dan ran. There doesn't seem to be a lot of claims coming in based upon something that happened as a result of COVID-19, but with the forthcoming hopeful as soon as can be, shipment of vaccines, as the cargo claims people will tell you, that's fraught with danger as far as liability is concerned. And the question is, what effect will the convention have on those claims? And for those of you who, like Bart and I, are in the United States, at least we can tell you about, for the domestic carriers, the effect of any defenses. Under the convention, as you may well know, there are certain defenses available to you under Article 18 and Article 19, and possibly Article 20 of the convention. None of those relate to what people call act of God or force majeure. It just is, that defense doesn't exist. Article 18 talks about inherent vice, defective packaging, act of war, armed conflict, and the one that we've had in the United States, we've had at least one decision, the act of the public authority carried out in connection with the entry, exit, or transit of cargo. So while there is no force majeure defense, there is, at least in the US case, was had to do with a shipment of cheese coming over from France that spoiled while in the carrier's custody here at JFK, because it took a long time for the claimant or the consignee to clear it. The court said, well, you know, you had problems, Mr. Consignee, getting the customs people to take a look at your cheese. As a result, it spoiled. That's an act of the public authority. It's not an act, not a fault of the carrier. So the carrier was absolved of any liability. Now, as I said, there are some fairly large domestic carriers. Courtney can tell you about her company that carries stuff domestically. I don't know whether Atlas and Polar do domestic, but some of the American and Delta definitely do. And I know from experience that American and Delta, those domestic shipments are not covered by the convention, as we well know, but they are covered by the contract of carriage, which incorporates their terms and conditions by reference. And I can speak for at least two of the carriers have in their tariffs or conditions of contract, they're no longer filed tariffs, exclusions from liability. And the first one is act of God, and also act of public authorities acting within their apparent authority, postponement or delay of any flight because of force majeure, government regulations, or for any other reason beyond the carrier's control. So if there is something that's COVID related that causes a delay, you have the possibility of calling it a force majeure act of God. Now, getting back to the convention, the carrier is liable for delay unless it can show it took all necessary measures, or now called reasonable measures. It used to be on the Warsaw Convention, necessary measures. So there are defenses, but it's up to you. The burden of proof, both under Article 18 and 19, is on the carrier. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the way I see the landscape in the United States.
Rainer, do you have additional thoughts?
I don't have much to add. I also, personally, I have not seen a big increase of cargo claims other than passenger claims. There were many court cases in respect of cancellation, but the German courts obviously regard COVID-19 as extraordinary circumstances. So in Germany, we also would argue the Article 18, Article 19 defenses. Especially, we have decisions in Germany stating that it does not matter whether or not the act of the public authority was justified or not. So if there is an act of public authority carried out in connection with the entry, exit, or transit of the cargo, that would exempt the carrier from being liable. As I said, I have not seen any other current actual decision from a German court related to COVID-19.
Yeah. Now, a few years ago, we had the volcano event in Iceland that caused flight cancellations and flight delays. And I suspect that affected the European carriers more than other carriers from around the world. Do you see that being a similar event, Rainer, a different event than this?
Yes, I would definitely argue from a legal perspective that this situation would be very similar. I mean, both events are beyond the carrier's control. There is nothing you could do. I mean, I have seen some cases on the passenger side where airlines reduced their flight plan because there were simply not enough passengers who wanted to fly. So some plaintiff's lawyer then argue maybe it was an economical decision to cancel a flight. But as far as I can see, the cargo flights sometimes even increased. So in Germany, some passenger planes were used for cargo transportation. So I have not seen such cases either.
Okay. Is there, and I'll ask anyone from the panel, is there the possibility of raising some kind of governmental authority defense if the government is shutting down airspace or somehow delaying this cargo from getting transported?
I would think yes. I think yes, it definitely would be able to do that. And I think it's sort of the loss prevention, harking back to Bart talked about the volcano things. There were some shippers or claimants who were saying, well, one, you shouldn't have accepted the shipment because you knew the volcanoes were happening. Two, you should have done something else. And carriers, and I'm sure they will do it, embargo shipments at that point, or they had a duty at least to try to divert them to some other way to get around the volcano. But if the government shuts down the airports, that's to me, it's a complete defense.
Okay. What about non-convention cases within your countries? Are you seeing or anticipating any differences or changes in the way these claims are being handled? Ricardo?
First, here there are some differences in terms of how the force majeure issue would be interpreted. First of all, we have legislation about temporary rules resulting from the COVID-19 outbreak. Although this rule do not apply to cargo, it implies that the COVID situation would not be found as a force majeure to avoid a carrier's liability if the airline canceled the flight, of course. Note that here, airlines have not been prohibited to operate. There was not a shutdown in the airspace. What happened was regulations were issued to prohibit entry of foreign citizens with a few exceptions. So considering that airlines have always been permitted to operate, this would be a different situation comparing to the volcano cancellations. So in essence, having said that, although we didn't have any cargo claim about associated or delays associated with the COVID-19 outbreak, I would say that force majeure would not be a defense in favor of the carriers. That's a likely scenario.
Okay. Okay. Now, as far as the amount of claims are concerned, Giuseppe, you're with an insurer. What are you seeing with regard to the amount of claims? I know it's a little early in the pandemic, but are you starting to see issues as far as the amount of claims being made?
Well, we made an observation. I don't know if it's Lucy who will show the chart. For you who don't know, we are a subsidiary of Deutsche Lufthansa based in Germany, and we receive claims from our insured carriers and from cargo insurances. And the chart is not there yet.
For the audience, imagine a chart being there.
Okay. Well,
how many claims?
Yeah. No, the chart shows a comparison between the year 2019 and 2020 of all cargo claims we received from May to August. And if you have a look at the red dots indicate that the amount of claims from May to August 2020 were inferior to the number in 2019. And this observation could lead to the simple conclusion that the decrease of claims results from the pandemic and from the reduced air traffic. However, this was not our impression. The reduced air traffic was not the reason for the decrease of the claims. I do not have any statistics, but the reduced air traffic did not significantly affect the transportation of cargo by air. The reason why the claims decreased must nevertheless be seen in the pandemic. Many companies all over the world reduced manpower temporarily, and so that neither our insureds nor the cargo insurances forwarded us all claims in that period. So we now see that we receive more and more claims, similar to the number of claims that were filed in 2019.
Okay. Yeah. Just the next upcoming issue, which the other panel has touched upon, is and Frank mentioned it as well, is the upcoming issue that all the carriers are going to have with the transportation of vaccines. I read a Wall Street Journal yesterday that many carriers are preparing for how they're going to transport the vaccines when a vaccine is available. And I think IATA estimated that it would require at least 8,000 flights on Boeing 747 aircraft to transport the necessary vaccines. And I've seen other groups estimate even a higher amount of flights. Giuseppe, staying with you, as an insurer, do you have concerns or thoughts regarding this upcoming, I don't want to say event, but something that's going to happen with this transportation of vaccines that's likely down the road?
Yes and no, indeed. Well, the transportation of vaccines could cause us some problems, that's true, especially in our capacity as insurer if damages occur, because the value of these shipments will be very high. Just to give an example, if we have a transportation with a value of $15 million US, and that is shown on the master hour bill, the question is, would possible damages be covered under the policy, under our policy? And generally speaking, the coverage does not depend on the nature of goods, obviously. The issue is the declared value for carriage. That would be the issue. And for us, but also for the carrier, it makes a big difference if a declared value for carriage is mentioned on the master airwheel bill, which rarely happens with other goods. But we believe, or it's not unlikely, that the carrier's customers insist on adding a declared value for carriage on the master airwheel bill due to the high value of the vaccines. And in that case, as you know, the liability is not limited to the maximum liability amount according to the applicable convention. And as a consequence, the carrier must compensate the total amount, in this case scenario, $15 million US. And it follows that we as liability insurer would have to reimburse $15 million US. And if, as you can imagine, we are not keen to pay such high amounts and such high sums. So what would be my recommendation to prevent such case scenarios would be, first of all, we must differentiate between the different insurances. We are the liability insurer of the airlines, of the carriers, whereas the carrier's customers have an insurance for their shipments, the cargo insurance. And in the event that the carrier's customer, which is basically the shipper, insists on adding the declared value on the master airwheel bill, the carrier should more than ever advise the customer to get insurance for the goods he intends to convey, and that in our case for the vaccines. And his cargo insurance will then reimburse the total amount and the total value of the vaccines, so that from the customer's perspective, there is no benefit from adding the declared value for carriage on the master airwheel bill anymore. And without a declared value for carriage, the carrier, as well as we in our capacity as liability insurer, will be only obliged to pay the maximum liability amount. At least that is true for many jurisdictions. Ricardo will explain the legal situation in Brazil in a few moments, which is slightly different. Well, and as a conclusion, the carrier should reject any shipment of vaccines without cargo insurance and with a declared value for carriage on the master airwheel bill. At least this is our position from an insurance perspective. I know it's a commercial decision, but otherwise we would run the risk to pay really high amounts. And as already explained, in the worst case scenario, we had to pay millions and millions in the future. And in that case, all liability insurers have no option but to increase the premium and to include exclusions of liability in the policy. That would be the only way to cope with this situation. Just to end, I know, or it goes without saying, that the best way is still to prevent the damage itself. And my suggestion for the carriers would be to establish a procedure, especially for the transportation of vaccines, including the aspects that I've just mentioned. And from my point of view, it is also crucial that the customer chooses the right product. I believe the panel before us touched on that point. The carrier should not accept every single booking request. If the customer wishes to transport vaccines as general cargo, for example, this would be a completely inadequate way of transportation. And one last point, I believe that communication is key. On the one hand, between the carrier and the customer, and on the other hand, between the carrier and the liability insurer, us, for example. We do have challenging times, and these are new situations we didn't know before. And the transportation of vaccines is definitely a sensitive topic due to the high values. So that's my point of view. It's a little bit long, but that's our perspective. And
and that opens up a number of topics, and we can come back on the declared value. But I just want to go back to the not only the transportation of vaccines, but the transportation of pharmaceuticals and other temperature-controlled products generally, because I know the earlier panel touched on that a bit, and I know they've received a number of questions. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit. Anyone want to take the lead on discussing just generally airway bills, which have instructions on them as far as keeping cargo at a certain temperature? How would you as an attorney, or how would your jurisdiction respond to those types of issues when an airway bill says to keep something in a certain temperature and the carrier either doesn't or is not able or just generally doesn't abide by those instructions? Frank, you want to start us with that?
Yeah, well, I cannot call to mind right now any decision that talks about it too much. We've had a situation where temperature requirements were put on an air bill and the origin station crossed them off. But later on, there was an issue about damages, and the court basically said, okay, I'm not going to get into that, whether it was a valid entry or not. Is it a condition of contract or not? But that is the issue. Does it become a condition of contract when you say you will not provide that kind of a service, but your shipper puts it on? The problem, and we've had this, we've been here 15 years of these conferences, and I think at every conference we've said, and every carrier says, yeah, I tell the stations don't accept air bills with temperature requirements on that we can't meet, and we see those claims year in and year out because they want it. It's hard to turn away shipments, and I guess I'm sort of diverting a little bit with regard to the high value of vaccines and things. I've seen in the past where the least instructions are, if somebody's going to say, I'm going to ship a $50 million shipment, red light should go up, and internally people should say, do we want to take it? Will our insurer let us take it? You got to get permission before you say, okay, we'll take a $50 million shipment with no declared value or with no shipper's interest insurance, like Giuseppe said. That is a good idea to get them to do shipper's interest insurance. But as far as putting the temperature requirements on, it's going to be a never-ending problem, because people will put a temperature requirement on where they've just gone general cargo, or they've said one service and they say, well, you didn't do it in the right cooler, things like that. It's something that, especially with vaccines, you're going to run into a lot of that. You may end up with down the line actions by people saying, you ruined the vaccine, therefore we didn't get treatment, and so got very sick or died. And you may get a claim like that because of the mishandling. It's fraught with danger.
Yeah. One question we've just received, and some of you have touched on it, and I know it was touched on earlier, is look, some of the forwarders don't want to pay the extra money for the special handling that pharmaceuticals require. Has anybody seen any cases involved where a carrier has required that somebody take on or pay for that type of handling? Or is it a defense? Is it a defense if they don't?
Well, I had a similar case. The freight forwarder actually refused to purchase cold chain transport. And the court found that if the instruction of keeping the ship in a certain temperature is on the airway bill, and if the carrier accepts the perishables which require refrigeration, regardless of the refusal from freight forwarders purchasing cold chain transport, this ruling found that the airline was liable if the loss, of course, results from lack of refrigeration. As Frank said, that would be part of the conditions of carriage if, according to Brazilian courts, if the refrigeration instructions are on the airway bill.
So you're saying in Brazil, that writing those instructions on the airway bill does become a condition of carriage.
That's the interpretation we saw in several rulings, correct. So whenever it's in the airway bill, it would be part of the contract. If the airline does not want to commit in terms of keeping refrigeration, the courts would say, well, then do not accept the shipment in the first place. And one comment I would take the opportunity to add, when we are talking about the vaccines, there is another effect resulting from a damage to the shipments that is not only the economic effect, but also the fact that losing this kind of damaging this kind of shipment of vaccines could result in a very serious damage to the image of the airline. Imagine millions of vaccines damaged. So that would have a very serious effect on the image of the company in light of the public health situation or a worsening of the public health situation of the country. So that's something to be considered as well. Not only the direct impact under the economic perspective, but also in this, damage to the image of the company.
Yeah, no, that's certainly a serious concern. Rainer, give us a taste of the German or European perspective on these types of instructions on airway bills and just the general cold chain or temperature controlled handling and the claims that result.
Yeah, I think in Germany it's pretty clear. So if it is printed on the airway bill that the goods have to be kept in a certain temperature range, and this airway bill is accepted by the carrier, signed by the carrier, the German courts most of the time refer to Article 11 of the Montreal Convention, stating that the airway bill brings evidence for the conclusion of the contract. So the German courts then say it was agreed between the parties and the carrier accepted that the consignment can be kept within this temperature range. And if then this was not the case and the damage was caused, then the carrier will be held liable by the German courts. So on the other hand, if the shipper was offered a special cooling chain, cold chain transportation, and which is obviously more expensive than a normal transportation, and the shipper refuses to do so, there could also be contributory negligence on the side of the shipper if then the damage was caused.
So
you'd have to document that. That's the thing. You really do have to document that, because if it's your burden of proof as a carrier to take advantage of Article 20.
That's right.
So courts in Europe are using that failure to use temperature-controlled transportation or as a defense.
Well, at least in cases where there was no special agreement. So obviously you cannot rely on the contributory negligence if you accepted an airway bill in which it is stated that the goods have to be kept within a certain temperature range, because with accepting that you show or signalize the shipper that you are able to do so, that you are able to keep these temperatures during the transportation. But if a carrier was handed over a temperature-sensitive consignment and there is nothing printed on the airway bill, but maybe the shipper said it cannot get too hot, for example, and then the carrier offers this special mode of transportation with a cold chain transportation, and the shipper refuses to do so because he does not want to pay anything more, then there could be contributory negligence on the side of the shipper.
Okay. We could probably talk about temperature-controlled shipments for our entire panel, but I just want to turn back to something that Giuseppe raised, which is the declared value for carriage. I know that's often come up in other courts. Ricardo, you want to give us a little discussion of that issue? I think we lost Ricardo for a moment. Frank or Rainer? thoughts on
Well,
the
I think
Ricardo?
Yeah, Frank, go ahead, please.
Well, we've experienced things. I don't want to talk about Brazilian law because I certainly cannot give any opinions on Brazilian law with any certainty at all. But what we've been experiencing, and Ricardo, when he gets back on, can confirm this. Two things that decisional law down there with regard to the applicability of the convention and entry and interpretation of the convention. With regard to declared value for carriage, some courts down there have said even where there's no declared value for carriage, they have not enforced the limitation because they said, oh, you had access or you should have had access to the invoice. And then you would have known what this was a high value shipment, whatever the value was. And we're going to assume that you would know, and therefore you're going to be liable for the invoice value. I've seen this years ago with an Italian interpretation also. It's not the interpretation that I've ever seen in the United States. The other Brazilian thing that Ricardo could, talk about is the fact that there have been decisions now saying there is no Supreme Court decision saying that the Montreal Convention governs exclusively cargo cases. The decisions that were down there were passenger cases, and that seems to be fairly settled law. But now there have been exceptions saying, no, the convention doesn't apply to cargo cases, and especially where it's subrogated cases. They're saying where the insurance company subrogates, they're not bound by the convention, just the shipper was bound by the convention. Now, I know we've been talking back and forth with Ricardo and giving him case law in the United States, but Bart will tell you, that the insurer steps into the shoes of its insured. And if the insured was bound by the convention, why wouldn't the insurer be? But in Brazil, they don't seem to think so at this stage. That is not the high court yet, but it's an argument that's being made at some times and not. So, but Brazil is a wonderful place to try to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Rainer, how's the declared value for carriage addressed in Europe?
Well, basically in Germany, it is pretty clear. So only if a value is declared, and on the front page of the airway bill, if there is the NVD, no value declared, shippers cannot rely that actually was the case. But it remains to be seen with the upcoming vaccine transportations whether this will stay the same, because the German plaintiffs lawyers, they always try to break the limits, which was not that hard under the Warsaw Convention, but almost impossible under the Montreal Convention. And with the vaccines, with this very high value but relatively low weight, I could imagine this could become a problem. And there is one decision, not from Germany, but from Austria's highest court, rendered some years ago. And maybe we have the time that I talk about this decision, which is very interesting. The plaintiff was a transport insurer of the shipper, brought action against the carrier, claiming more than 350,000 euros because of the undisputed damage to a consignment consisting of medicine, so similar to vaccines. And the carrier was instructed to transport the medicine by plane from Vienna to Lithuania, so Montreal MC99 was applicable. And the plaintiff claimed the full value of the medicine, whereas the limits would have been much lower. And when instructing the carrier, a contract value of more than 350,000 euro was communicated in writing, and a commercial invoice was handed over on the same amount, was handed over to the carrier. But in the master airway bill, it was mentioned NVD, so no value declared. And the plaintiff argued in the legal proceedings that a special declaration of interest in the meaning of Article 22, Section 3 was made to the effect that the limits should not apply. And at the end, the court actually ruled that the carrier cannot rely on the limits, since the carrier had made a valid declaration of interest in the sense of Article 22, Section 3. And in particular, it is stated in the grounds of the judgment that such declaration should be a one-sided act from the shipper when handing over the consignment. And when the carrier then accepts the transportation on the basis of this declaration, a mutual agreement has to be considered, the court said. And the court also ruled, which is very interesting, that it does not change anything if NVD is printed on the airway bill, and also the court held that the declaration is not only valid if a supplementary sum has been paid by the shipper, since such sum would have had been requested by the carrier, which was not the case here. So as I said, that was a decision from, I think, 2013 or 2014 in Austria. We have not seen that in Germany, but that could be tried by the plaintiff's lawyers here as well.
That's a worrisome development, but hopefully it won't spread. We had planned with Ricardo here. We'd planned on doing a Brazil update, because those of you who operate to and from Brazil know that it's very unique and a very litigious jurisdiction in which they're loath to impose the limitations of liability. And I know he's been very involved in IATA's efforts to try to get Brazil to follow the convention. But let's move on to some quick questions we received. I'll start with one. In a partial loss situation, or just in calculating the limitation of liability generally, does your jurisdiction use gross weight or chargeable weight? Frank, you want to give the U.S. point of view on that?
For the U.S., we have no choice. It's chargeable weight. It's on the back of the air bill, and if the claim is based upon the chargeable weight, you better pay it. As we've said in past conferences, if you can get away with the actual weight, try it. But technically, the air bill says it, you have to do it. That's what you base your freight charges on. You have to pay that based on the chargeable weight.
Rainer?
We always, as defense lawyers, try to argue that on the reverse side of the airway bill, it is specifically stated that in the US, you have to calculate on the basis of the chargeable weight. And then we argue that since this is only stated for the US, we have to take into consideration the lower or gross weight. But there are also some decisions arguing that if you calculate your charges on the basis of a certain weight, you also have to calculate the limit of liability on the basis of this weight. So it's a little bit inconsistent in Germany.
Yeah, and we, as insurer, obviously we have out-of-court claims, and we take into consideration the gross weight. There are two exceptions. One is the US, but the other one is Israel. So Israel, as far as I know, it's the same case that they take the chargeable weight to calculate the liability amount.
I've had experience in Argentina where they use the weight of the whole shipment, even if only a part of it is lost, damaged, or delayed. So, as we said many times, you better check your jurisdiction before you do anything.
Yeah, and that was my next question. Right, Rainer, in Germany, is it if there's partial loss, is the calculation just based upon that portion that is damaged, or is it the whole consignment?
Well, it depends. So if you have 5 pieces and only one piece is damaged, you only calculate on the basis of the weight of the damaged piece. There is only the exception if this piece also affected, or the damage to this one piece also affected the value of the entire consignment. Then you have to calculate on the basis of the entire weight.
And that rule is the same in the U.S., right, Frank?
Yes, we've had a situation we were involved with where, for argument's sake, a helicopter blade was damaged, and the claim was for the value of the whole helicopter. And they said, yeah, the helicopter was no good without the blade. So you had to pay based on the weight of the whole helicopter.
So, well, good. Well, I think we're unfortunately getting to the end of our time, and I'm cognizant of IATA's keeping us on a good schedule. So I just want to thank Giuseppe and Frank and Rainer and Ricardo as well.
In absentia.
In absentia. And I'll turn it back to Christian.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Bart, and thank you everybody for this very interesting panel. I think it also are very enlightening comments. It's always a pleasure to listen to this panel discoursing on legal issues. I realized there were more questions and that we were not able to address everything. And like I said, it's difficult to squeeze in 90 minutes what we can usually do in 2.5 days. It's also been a cliche somehow to discuss about the new normal. This was mentioned also in the first panel, the new situation that the airline industry is facing it right now over the past few months. And I think it was very interesting to hear first from the claims manager panel that there have been some changes in the nature of the claims that have been provided in this new environment. However, in terms of the claims management, the basic rules are applicable and the legal provisions remain the same. But it was also interesting in that panel to hear about the need to be customer-centric. That's still a key concern for the airlines, and to focus on the why a customer feels that the claim is due is an important thing to keep in mind for airline members, I think. And this spirit of dialogue is what we try to encourage in this type of events like this webinar, or better even a conference where we can really have total interaction with the public. It was also very insightful, I think, to hear from the legal panel that there are some uncertainties as to how various jurisdictions may appreciate the current environment and the resulting constraints. We can look at past situations, but there is nothing, I mean, if we look at the volcano situation, so on, there is nothing that is really comparable to the situation that we're facing today. So it's somehow we can figure out, but also we cannot exactly figure out what to expect from courts depending on the jurisdiction, and it will be interesting to see how things evolve over the coming months and years. Again, from an IATA perspective, the purpose of this event is not really to resolve specific claims or discuss specific scenarios, but really to try to learn from each other, how we function, how we think, and mostly how we can prevent claims to occur. That's again the key concern. Nobody wants claim, even claims manager, even though their business is to resolve claim, they are not happy to see claims coming. They want to prevent them. We also discussed the one of the most challenging times in our industry right now, which is the upcoming carriage of pharma, especially vaccines, and hopefully vaccines very soon. And I think it was very useful to hear again that there is a need to correctly select from a customer's perspective and also correctly offer from an airline perspective the appropriate service. There is also a need to take into account the current environment, which impacts, for example, flight certainty or manpower. And some of the service we provide with IATA, like the CIV programs, which have been mentioned, especially in the first part of this seminar, CIV programs on pharma, perishables, and live animals, are our attempts from IATA to define the appropriate services for this type of shipments. We are now also working on specific guidance material for medical transportations in order to better face the current challenges of fulfilling the air cargo mission of delivering goods worldwide. And we'll make soon this guidance material available as well. So if you're interested in what IATA is doing in this respect, or what it's doing in general for air cargo, I encourage you to register to our monthly updates, the IATA Cargo Tracker. You can do so by sending an email to our email address, cargo@iata.org, or by going on the IATA Cargo webpage, where you will find the registration link in the margin. And of course, the best way to continue this discussion that we have today would be to meet at our next event. It's of course too early to know when we can again meet face-to-face. and when such event will be able to take place. But please do keep an eye for the next IATA Cargo Claims and Loss Prevention Conference in the future, so we can try to continue that conversation. With this, I would like to thank again all the panelists for today, as well as you for your attendance. We had quite a good attendance for this webinar, and I hope you found today's discussions useful. And as we mentioned previously, we will make the recording of this webinar available to the registered participants. We will also circulate a survey to help us improve our webinars. So please don't be shy in commenting in the survey that you will receive. And I look forward to hearing from you. And in the meantime, of course, I wish you to please stay safe. Thank you very much. Goodbye.